Hello to all of you. Good morning for us in the Western Hemisphere, and good evening for us following us in the Eastern Hemisphere. I'd like to start first with a disclaimer, an important disclaimer, as you just saw at the end of the presentation, in which all statements expressed by Getúlio Vargas Foundation employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represents their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in these events of their own free will, and they consent to be on record in this broadcast, which will be later posted on FGV official channels. So I would like to start presenting to you our project. This seminar, this webinar here is the one of two webinars that was part of the project that is discussing global value chains from Brazilian and South Korean perspective. We have reports here to show. I'll share my my screen with you guys right now. Here. This one is the first report that we designed, and I am the author of this one, discussing economic developments and global value chain insertion, a view from Brazilian and South Korean lenses. We also have reports from both our speakers today. Joonkoo gave us these reports, global value chains and GVC's oriented policy, insights from South Korea experience, and the contribution from our dear friend Otaviano Canuto, Brazil, South Korea, and global value chains, a tale of two countries. So all those reports, they are available to everyone. They are in the link from them are in the description of the YouTube. If you go there in the end of the description, you see the link of each of those reports. If you have any questions during the seminar, please go through the Slido. If you go to the description, the very first line of the description, the second line is the link to the Slido program where you can post your questions, and we will answer some of those questions here by the end of the seminar. Okay, so I'd like to begin presenting my dear friend Otaviano Canuto, which is a senior fellow for Policy Center for the South. He has experience in many different important institutions like the World Bank, the International American Development Bank, International Monetary Funds, among Brazilian governments, among others. Otaviano, the idea here is, first for you, is to level the playing field. I'll ask you the same question for you and from my friend Joonkoo is, what are the major characteristics from Brazil and its international insertion? How Brazil in its trajectory managed to insert itself in the international commerce trade economy per se.
Right. Thank you, Leonardo. It's a great pleasure to be here, to have participated in this project, and it's a pleasure to be here as well with Joonkoo Lee. In a nutshell, to a large extent, Brazil has bypassed the actual revolution in trade, in foreign trade, and global trade that has taken place in the last few decades. The option for Brazil has been to keep its manufacturing industry very closed. In fact, at my time when I was vice president at the World Bank, I did a study with a couple of colleagues comparing the degree of closeness of the Brazilian trade vis-a-vis equivalent economies in the world, and Brazil was the closest one. High tariffs, very often the use of non-tariff quantitative barriers to imports and so on. And this ended up, on the one hand, leading to very, very, very dense local production chains, but the cost of that has been, and it was, over the decades, at levels of productivity and of competitiveness lower than otherwise. To a large extent, this is the opposite case to the way by which South Korea moved on from its previous industrialization process. by the way, by 1980, both Brazil and Korea had very similar, even taking into account the different size of the economies, but similar structures in terms of the weight of the heavy and chemical industry in their GDPs. But while they both also faced a debt crisis associated with the shortfall of foreign finance coming from banks. But while, let's say, Brazil maintained its trade orientation over the decades that followed with very short and brief moments of trade opening, like in the beginning of the 90s. Fact is that Korea moved to another model, one in which it was able to enter the metal mechanics sectors by inserting itself into value chains. And that allowed, I attribute that to a large extent to the differences in productivity, the productive evolution of both countries. Of course, this is not all. There is also an important domestic counterpart to that. Korea did a formidable effort to lift levels of education, of technical preparation of the labor force. Brazil lagged behind. Only recently, there has been some effort to increase the degrees of schooling of the population, but still quality-wise is lagging behind. And this is something quite important to take into account to understand the different performance of both countries and the success in trade of Korea. And also, I would highlight the evolution of the business environment, because of course, insertion into value chains demands a country to have a business environment that is not unfriendly to transactions. And whereas Brazil has also lagged behind in the evolution of its business environment and so on. Today, there's still an important component of the agenda for development. And an important part of the business environment is obviously infrastructure. And Brazil has lagged behind. We haven't managed to maintain a level of investments in infrastructure enough to even sustain the existing precarious infrastructure. And this implies a price, because of course you'll have losses because of the inappropriate supply of infrastructure service. I would say that those factors that I mentioned are the ones to explain why Korea managed to move from where they were. They had similar levels of per capita income by 1980. And in fact, while South Korea today is a high-income country, Brazil is still grappling with the middle-income trap. Just a kickstart.
Brilliant. I think that's the main idea. So now I turn to my colleague, Joonkoo. Joonkoo Lee is an associate professor from the School of Business of the prestigious Hanyang University in Seoul, in South Korea. Joonkoo, happy to have you here. Again, the idea is the same. To level the playing field, please share with us the major characteristics that inserted South Korea in the international economy.
Thank you, Leonardo. Thanks for inviting me to this exciting event. And it's great to be with Otaviano for this wonderful discussion. I think as I highlighted in my report for the project, I think it's an important thing is that they're integrating into the global value chain. It's really critical for their Korea's economic growth since the late 1960s. I think it's the global value chain is by that time largely unknown. I think it's the concept even was developed and there until like the early 1990s. So I think it's, but there things already there happened at the time, was happening at the time, and the Korea's economic growth story about the Korean economic growth is there, in one sense, I would argue that there is their story of expanding the global value chain, particularly their East Asian part of their world, and also many of their East Asian countries, including Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, and later China and Vietnam. They all are achieved their economic growth, or well, to a large degree, export growth through integrating into the global value chain. So I think it highlights that the importance of like the global international economic insertion in the economic development, at least based on their East Asian and the Korean experience. I highlighted that there are two different characteristics of their Korea's integration into the global value chain. One is they're moving in. Basically, how the countries has been inserted to the global value chain. The second is how to move up the value chain, so that they're upgrading. Insertion and upgrading is their two important dynamics that is interrelated all the time. But I think we need to separate a little bit analytically how the Koreas was inserted to their GVC, and how the countries or their firms, the Korean firms, actually climb up their value chain. When it comes to I think is moving in, I think is the Otaviano, as he pointed out, that I think is in some sense Korea was lucky. I think is because that in the 1960s and the early 1990s, there's a kind of like the migration of some of the manufacturing functions from Japan initially, and then from the US. So that kind of like their international, kind of like the change in the international economic landscape, I think is provide their really important their opportunity for Koreans to actually jump into their global value chain. So, but I think it's opportunity, even though the opportunity were there, unless the Korean firms actually seize the opportunity, I think their outcome would be vastly different. So I think seizing the international opportunity is really important. But at the same time, I think is building linkage with the foreign firms and to seek their, whether it is their technical resources or their new kind of like their new products or their product innovation. A lot of like the different resources actually came from their foreign firms, or their formal tie with the foreign firms, or sometimes informal tie with some of the engineers or their developers or their small firms. So a lot of like their international linkage, which I think is given that the Korea is relatively small open economy, I think is much more kind of natural for the Korean firms trying to tap into the international resources compared to the countries with their large size, with the domestic huge domestic market like the US or the Brazil or the China. I think they're more like could be more internally oriented, but from their small country perspective, I think living with the external kind of like the situation, I think is kind of unavoidable. I think is so when it comes to the building the linkage, I think is important thing is that from the government perspective is developing their kind of like the sector specific plans. Korea is well known for their macroeconomic, the 5-year plan, or their government state-oriented the industrial policy. But I think it's more when it comes to the insertion to the global value chain, I think it's more important thing is more the sector level planning. So because that each sectors has a different structure and the dynamics when it comes to the GBC. So I think and also local firms need and also their weaknesses are also very sector specific. So different local firms in different sectors have very different conditions. So I think that is also play an important role for their insertion of Korean firms into the global value chain. But I think insertion is different from upgrading because the insertion to the global value chain is not enough, because without continuous upgrading, well, insertion could be very temporary or unsustainable. And because of a lot of like international competition, also the speed of like the technological change and their market change. And so in response, I think it's the Korean government and the firms basically try to build up the robust local linkage and trying to nurture the local capability. I think it's the innovation or the human resource, like the infrastructure, as Otaviano mentioned in his report. So I think it's, well, for example, the Korean firms moving from garment to textile, and they're in the automobile industries, they're moved from their assembling their automobile to their producing the parts and components. And so that kind of like their upgrading and through their building their by building a local linkage, I think was very critical for upgrading. So finally, I think is well, they're not just staying in a sectors, and but the many Korean firms trying to venture into the new sectors, from the right manufacturing to their capital intensive or like the technology intensive manufacturing, such as like their information technology and electronics in the 1980s, or right after the debt crisis in the third world, and after the millennium is like the cultural and creative industry. It's a kind of like the new driving forces for the Korean economy. So I think it's that kind of like upgrading from more like their low tech to mid tech to high tech. I think it's that kind of trajectory also play an important role for the countries to actually capture more values, or they're capturing more gains from their GVC insertion.
Excellent, thank you. I think it was very lively. In fact, I have just a question to grasp this last idea of upgrading. But before that, I'm going to get back to Otaviano. And Otaviano, okay, it's clear to me now, I mean, that how Brazil developed, had this, let's say, 10 decades trajectory in development of closing down its economy. So what have been done in the last few years, in your opinion, from the next few years, what's the future holds for us? I mean, from many experts, we have been tracing a not ideal trajectory. So we should be open more the economy or something like that. I mean, there was many different discussions about how to do it within Mercosul, outside Mercosul, or whatever. So my question is, in your perspective, what's happening right now? What's the rationale of the political elites of Brazil, even the economical elites? They are moving away from this heritage, or they are doubling down in its bets? I mean, what's the future holds to us in this near future?
Great question. So Leonardo, having said what I said about the closure of Brazilian trade, we have three examples of success in terms of productivity, competitiveness, and ability to play the game globally. That, to some extent, confirms what I'm saying about the rest of the Brazilian experience with trade. So those three cases of success that I come to my mind straightforward, they are Embraer, Petrobras, the oil company, before it was submitted to a series of local production requirements and overinvestments and so on. And the third one is the agriculture sector. What do these three cases of success have in common? The ability to play as a part, as the core of global value chains. Embraer is able to be competitive and to play the game in selling in planes in the world because it has acquired the capability to design well and to build planes, but it is able to buy wherever it wants in the world the parts for its planes. And the same thing was with Petrobras before the requirements of local production. And that made the Petrobras a plane, a high-level competitive firm in given its ability, its capability to research and explore and produce in sea. Yeah, and third, agriculture. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but your point is just exactly what I'm thinking about. Embraer has specific regime just for the company to buy things from abroad. That's different from everything in the Brazilian economy. So your point is perfect to illustrate that idea.
And that was the case with Petrobras as well. Before, the government reestablished local production requirements and so on. In agriculture. So we had three cases of success that have in common the fact that they have been allowed to bypass the trade protection structure, but also which gives me the chance to highlight what I would say is the core variable in this whole thing, which is the building up of capabilities by firms, capabilities to learn the new production processes, to adapt technologies, to be creative in the use of technology, which is exactly what South Korea has mastered quite well. And one important thing there is the structure of incentives to the private sector. In Korea, you had a pattern of rewarding well those private agents that received the benefits of industrial policy, but as long as the beneficiary exhibited some ability to either occupy market shares abroad and or to reduce the cost of production in Korea itself. So the logic of rewarding the winners and punishing losers, which lies behind the evolutionary selection that led to the shables, to a large extent, incentivize the private recipients of the public support to invest in technological capabilities. In Brazil, we had a different pattern, rewarding the winners, but also helping and saving the losers, which led to a microeconomic logic in which instead of investing in capabilities, the beneficiaries rather use the profits to diversify their portfolio in order to diversify their relationship with the state. I believe this is a key component of the success that Korea has demonstrated in using the availability of technology. Now, on the other hand, in Brazil, we have the survival of inefficient firms in all the protected sectors, and I explained that. Also, while I was a vice president at the World Bank, a couple of colleagues did a study approaching the distribution of firms according to the efficiency in Brazil and compared it to other emerging markets, and the rate of survival of inefficient firms, pulling down the average productivity was higher than in these other countries. And of course, this higher capacity of inefficient firms to survive in the Brazilian economy is due to a lack of competition that includes not having trade openness. So looking forward, I think that even if any trade opening process may lead to a shrinking of a selective transformation in some of the existing value chains in Brazil, which are very dense, or too dense. The density of production chains in metal mechanics in Brazil is above any other country, comparable country. So we might have a shrinking of some of those, but let's say the outcome would be the ability of the manufacturing sector in Brazil to produce with lower costs and with higher productivity. And this can be compensated by the enhancement of other value chains, particularly those that depend a lot on natural resource, which Brazil is a rich country on, and to develop value chains of another nature. So I do believe that any movement of Brazil out of the closeness in which the trade structure today is imposed upon producers might have results in terms of higher productivity and therefore higher ability to compete. Of course, we are not living through a time very much friendly to trade opening, unfortunately, since the global financial crisis and after the trade tensions that we have watched in recent years. It's to be seen whether those trade tensions will return after coronavirus and so on. There's still something in the open. But nonetheless, Brazil is the one who suffers the price of being closed. And it's understandable that it would be easier to go that road by negotiating trade agreements. And that's why it was such a good news, the achievement of a negotiation with the European Union. But then we have other items on this agenda. Unfortunately, the perception and the policies of the government, the neglect vis-a-vis with respect to the Amazon deforestation may become an impediment to moving forward in that direction. But there is no other way, in my view, for Brazil to move ahead unless, reviewing its trade orientation and using to the most possible the opportunities that global integration may provide.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Otaviano. Joonkoo, I'm going to pick up where you left about upgrading, because I think this issue is very interesting and you have been dedicating a lot of time to that. Again, looking for the near future to South Korea. I mean, it's clear to us. I mean, makes sense when you say that upgrading perhaps is the next step. I mean, especially not only upgrading in the sense the chain. I mean, adding value to where you are inserted, but also how to insert local companies, local firms in the chains. So seems to me that perhaps it's the one of the biggest challenges to South Korea to keep up in the leading pack of the global value chain. So could you elaborate a little bit more about, I mean, since the diagnosis is quite clear, I mean, we have to moving up, upgrading in the global value chains, both vertically in the sense of the production and horizontally in the sense of the firms, the local firms. What are the challenges here, and what are the major impediments to the government and business to move forward in this strategy?
Well, yes. Well, that's a really important question, I think. Well, from Korea's perspective, I think there is a lot of challenge, which is not necessarily similar to the challenge Brazil Brazil is confronting. But I think it's an important thing is that the Korean economy actually have been surviving a lot of the different challenges in their global economic condition over time. And every juncture of in the global economy, actually, I think it's clear, at least they survived and weathered the crisis and their multiple crises over time, and to maintain the linkage to the global economy, and then they're improving their position, the Korean firms' position in the global the production networks. For example, the oil crisis in the 1970s and the debt crisis in the 1980s. Actually, it propelled the Korean the firms to think about their new developments, such as their information technology and electronics, and their development of the growth of the personal computers and the semiconductor, which has been their basis, the foundation of their economic growth over the last over the next 30 years. And also the Asian financial crisis of late 1990s. Think about that. Actually, there is a huge impact on their labor markets and their macroeconomic. But I think Korean firms actually use the opportunity to use that kind of their take advantage of that kind of their disruptive event to actually go outside, not just they're staying inside, they're staying domestically, but their outward investment actually increased dramatically since the late 1990s. That creates some kind of the new kind of the value chain, which is partly organized by the Korean multinationals. So multinationalization actually was prompted by the kind of the economic Asian financial crisis of the 1990s. And so I think it's a lot of change, a lot of the challenge actually pushed the Korean companies and the Korean the government to think refocus on their kind of the strategy of their global value chain integration. I think it's from their today's perspective, I think is their intended direction, what their Korean government particularly trying to do is, I think is how the Korea can have more innovative small and medium enterprises, because as it is well known that the Korean economy is hugely influenced by the handful of the big conglomerates, and that the powerful influence is still is persisting. But now the global economy is drastically changing. Their platform-based economy, and their more service orientation, their internet, and their all kind of the social medias, and their artificial intelligence. There's a lot of the technological changes and their market changes, and all Korean firms, large conglomerates, still mainly based on the manufacturing. So I think it's how the Korean their country can nurture more small and medium firms, which can be very highly innovative, but at the same time very strong in the upstream of the global value chain, not the manufacturing part, but for R&D and their product development, design, all those kind of things. And also how we can nurture the service sectors, because the service sector is compared to the manufacturing is still underdeveloped, and their global value chain so far is mainly focused on the manufacturing, but increasingly there is the growing importance of the service value chain, I think is increasingly globalized and internationalized. So I think that's the kind of the direction that the Korean government generally trying to take. But also there is a structural constraints. For example, their Korean domestic market is relatively small and compared to their any other neighboring countries. So I think is that limit their kind of could limit their the growth of the particularly service sector, because service sector is still, I think, is largely based on their domestic economy, and also their powerful large firms like the conglomerates, and they build up their own production networks, which is not national level, but it's increasingly regional level, like the Asian at the level of their region. For example, Samsung Electronics is one of their big company in Korea. It's a well-known global brand manufacturing their smartphone, and they only produce less than 10% of smartphone in Korea. And there are more than 90% of smartphone actually produced in China, but mostly Vietnam and India, and relatively small percentage actually produced in Brazil. So that actually highlight that how the Korean their multinationals actually expanded their production networks and the value chain, not beyond their national border, and then they're across the Asia and worldwide. And also there for that reason, I think is Korea's linkage to the global value chain is getting more complicated. Well, in the past, we just like the manufactured and export to their Western market, but nowadays, actually, most of the Korean firms' production done in their developing Asia, like the China, India, and Vietnam, and the Korea is actually supplier of the intermediate goods. So many of their semiconductors or their displays actually exported to the Vietnam only to be assembled as a smartphone and then exported worldwide. So it's a more like they're complicated kind of like the ties that like the Korean companies or the Korea generally has with like their global economy, not just looking toward like the Western market, but looking toward the Western market still important, but looking back and to their like the regional kind of like the production networks. So I think is there, from the Korean government perspective, I think is one of the biggest challenges that how to upgrade the domestic capability. Well, we understand a lot of like the manufacturing will eventually move away and move to their foreign country, and then what we'll have in their domestically, I think is most of the important thing is that I think is innovation, and also I think it's just today Korean government announced a plan to invest around like the $60 million until 2022 only for their material, part and components, and the equipment. So that's their Korean government think that their most important domain, the Korean firms have to be invested, and they're alongside like the public investment. And also I think China is the elephant in the room, at least in the Asian context. I think it's still beyond the Asia. I think it's because of a lot of reasons, rising production cost in China, but at the same time, like the U.S. and the China trade war and their COVID-19 accelerate that kind of like their tension. And so I think it's how the Korea is pivoting from China to the rest of the Asia, for example, Southeast Asia. So they're like the government put emphasis on their nurturing the ties with some of their Southeast Asian countries, like the Vietnam and the Indonesia are the two major, I think, destination nowadays for their Korean investment. So I think that is the kind of like their probably some of the like the futures we will see for the Korean economy.
Excellent, Joonkoo. In fact, you just said something that's makes me wonder. So I'm gonna make you a follow-up question on the last thing that you said about new trends, not new trends, but these new events of COVID-19, and also the trade war between China and US. I mean, in my perspective, perhaps those two events might present opportunity to South Korea, in the sense that one of the issues that we're discussing between global suppliers it's make us vulnerable to concentrate, to make everything very, very efficient and concentrates on just one supplier, China. And also the trade war with US and China might divert some of the trades towards South Korea. So are those two events presenting opportunities to South Korea in the perspective of the governments?
Well, I think my opinion is, these events like the U.S. and the China trade war and the COVID-19, we don't know yet what post-pandemic global value chain looks like, right? But I think is what it not only for those events, not only pose their opportunity, but also a lot of like the challenge to the Korean company, because that the Korean companies actually at the center of their trade ties or the value chain ties connecting the U.S. and the China. Because, for example, some like the Korean electronic companies exported a lot of like the semiconductors or their electronic components to China, and only those components actually assembled in China and exported to the U.S. and their European Union mainly. So when the U.S. actually, when the U.S. and China relations are deteriorated because of the trade tension, actually that's a huge hit to the Korean company, because that they're Chinese like the assemblers or the producers, manufacturers, may no longer buy their components from Korea. Well, not only Korea, I think that's a big concern for many of their East Asian suppliers, like the Korea and Taiwan also has a strong relationship with China through their value chain, also Japan. And so I think is as much as because of the U.S. and China tension, as much as that divert some of the trade and the trade flow to Korea, but at the same time, I think is because Korea is tightly integrated to the global value chain that connecting the U.S. and China. So I think is that there is some kind of the side effect or their fallout from that kind of the trade tension that might not necessarily be good for the Korean company. And also the problem is that nowadays because of that tension, the global value chain could be split into the two parts. One is the more China oriented, and the other is more like the US oriented. Well, because China and US is their two largest kind of the trading partner for Korea, I think is choosing a side is really difficult things, and for not only for their company's perspective, but also for their because that kind of their diplomatic tension or the conflicts has an impact on for example, the relation between the North Korea and South Korea, because that they're choosing a side between the U.S. and China is not just not only economic matter, but also has a significant implication to their national security and the diplomatic side. So I think I think it's quite challenging for Korea and the Korean firms. And COVID-19, I think is there is more their upside and downside as well. And for example, I think it's after the COVID-19, I think it's my expectation is that there is a more movement toward the more safe and secure value chains. And many companies and their countries wanted to have the value chain is more secure and more safe. And that means that there is a more stringent condition for participation. Actually, that may stifle the new entry. So that I think is given that the Korean company has have relatively established position in the global value chain, I think is that could give some of them to a kind of the breathing room from the competition with the China or the Vietnam or the others. But at the same time, I think there is a lot of the drive for reshoring, so bring the manufacturing back home. I think is that could lead the shrinkage of the global value chain. And from the Korean perspective, as a small, relatively small economy and open economy, I think the shrinkage of the global value chain can have a negative impact on the Korean firms and the economy in general, because that there are many of the Korean firms and employment, all that kind of things actually depending on their kind of their international flow of trade and investment. So I think there is a kind of upside and downside as well.
Excellent, very illustrative. Okay, so we are approaching to the end. We have already a couple of questions here from the audience. But before that, as I asked you before to think about it, I would like to close this part of our debate with some highlights. I mean, I will start with Otaviano. Otaviano, please say to us, I mean, what do you think that our audience should leave here thinking? I mean, what are the main issues, the main highlights? I mean, what nobody could forget after leaving this debate?
Great, and that will give me an opportunity to just to say something on the question that you asked Joonkoo, because I like very much his response, but I'd like to add the following. If there is a bottom line to what Joonkoo said, there are no winners in trade wars. No one wins. You're gonna have, let's say, to a large extent, trade wars means rising trade uncertainties, and that affects the level of investments and growth. The trade frictions and trade wars of the last 2 years have been responsible for world economy growth lower than otherwise. This is in the IMF's World Economic Outlook. Even if one may point out the transfer of cheap labor-intensive segments out of China to Vietnam and Malaysia and Cambodia, this was already, let's say, in the cards with the rebalancing of China. So there were no wins. On the contrary, I also would like to highlight that there are limits to this idea of COVID-19 provoking in itself changes in global value chains. Look, it is true that there is a political drive. It's to be seen where it is that Europe, US will redemarcate the line of sectors considered strategic. But from the company's standpoint, trying to diversify has cost implications, and cost matters. I've been participating in many events in which companies recognize the risk, the risk associated with being very much focused, but they all insist that the concentration, the degree of concentration that we have today, the pattern of geographical dispersion, is there not by chance. It's because of cost implications. So from the corporate strategy perspective, there are limits to how far reshoring induced by coronavirus will take place. It's the politics that may make a difference. Joonkoo remarks reminded me of a seminar last year where I was with Professor Jung Dong Lee, in which he called the middle innovation trap. So Korea has overcome the middle income trap, Brazil not. But now the challenge faced by Korea is to keep up the plate, when particularly as China itself, and China is the elephant in the room, is also moving to the top of the ladder. And you're gonna have, if you were to have these segmented two global systems, that will, let's say, create new challenge for Korea. The Asian crisis that he refers to, in my view, cannot be understood without taking into account China's exchange rate devaluation in 1995, which ended up stealing or sucking some of the manufacturing production out of Korea to a lesser extent, but definitely Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia and the Philippines. And that created the current account deficits that, let's say, even if the 1997 was a financial crisis in Asia, underlying it, there was the deterioration in current account balance in most of the countries. And that had to do with the entry of, with the movements taken by China. So this is, I think, is it's a quite important point made by Joonkoo that should be given. And to finalize my point as a message, I spoke about the benefits, the potential benefits of trade opening in Brazil, but it's also quite important to highlight the relevance of accompanying domestic reforms. We need to improve our business environment, including the infrastructure service, so as to allow Brazil to duly benefit from higher imports and exports. There will be challenge. New technologies are bringing challenge to the configuration of global value chains. But interestingly, the preconditions for success in the new era of manufacturing and of technology are the same as before, namely appropriate business environment, appropriate investments in infrastructure, appropriate investments in education, and particularly a trade environment that allows for the flows of knowledge. We should hammer this message home.
Excellent, perfect. I fully agree. Joonkoo, your message, what people here cannot live without having it the back of its mind.
Well, I think it's from at least Korea's experience, well, they're upgrading or they're keep ahead of the others in the global economy. Is there always a moving target? So the target is never stay in the same place because of there are a lot of because a lot of the new countries actually get involved in their global value chain. Well, starting from China, what Korea is by the 1960s and the 70s, one of the new kind of their entrance, right? And they're followed by the other countries. So I think is there the competition also their competition make their global value chain insertion and upgrading as a moving target. But at the same time, a lot of the technological change, artificial intelligence, the platform and their fourth industrial revolution things, I think is that dramatically change their landscape of their global competition in the coming decades. So I think that is another thing. The third thing I think is important, I'd like to highlight that is the market change, particularly their growing consciousness of the sustainability or the corporate social responsibility or the climate change, all those kind of the social issues, also important part of their challenge for their many countries and their many firms if they wanted to be a multinational company. So I think from that perspective, I think still, once again, I think we are at the critical juncture where we can we have to rethink about where their target is moving toward, right? And their what kind of their capability, whether local or regional or their global, because that some of the capability can be tapped in on the global scale. So I think is how to build the capability at the different scale. I think so. Their local, regional, and global value chain, I think is really important. Once again, innovation, upgrading, and their global engagement. I think that's the key things. I think whatever target is for the future.
Excellent. So now I'll revert to the questions. The first question here, I think, is direct to Otaviano. It's from Telmo Giorgi, if I read correctly. Well, the question is, the case of Embraer, Petrobras, and agro industry that you mentioned before raised the question of why their Brazilian supply chains have not upgraded in GVCs. So Otaviano, you have the floor again.
Right, thanks. That's a core question. Because of trade barriers, the logic of investment that over the decades on, let's say, take automobile. Originally, in the beginning of the automobile industry in Brazil, the logic was to offer tariff walls as a means to attract investment by foreign corporations. And that's how Brazil managed to have a highly integrated manufacturing industry in the case of automobiles with the local auto parts and so on. The price to pay for that has been, let's say, a level of quality of domestic automobiles that is far below the frontier with higher costs. And this whole thing only survives because of the tariffs. And obviously, some preferential trade agreements were not for Argentina and Mercosur. The Brazilian automobile industry would have got into a crisis for a long time. So it's a vicious circle. The industry, those manufacturing industry sectors were built behind the walls, but then it becomes a trap because either you open change the course, and the existing investors adapt their production systems, probably incorporating higher levels of imports of components and so on, or they stay behind the walls. And it's interesting to note how over time the foreign-owned automobile industry in Brazil has been a major champion of trying to get subsidies from the government. So you have foreign companies knocking on the door of the government, give me some subsidies, I need that to survive to the foreign competition and so on. So the whole industrial sector pays the price of this very ambiguous combination of tariff walls, tariff protection with a lower productivity that makes the investments survive only through protection.
Great. Well, we are pushing to the limits of our time. There is one other question here that someone that did not identify himself or herself. It states like that: how differently does the current financial crisis and the cooling of trades opening affects Brazil and Korea's GVCs? Somehow I think this question connects with the idea of the trade wars. So the impact of the trade wars in the lesson opening. I mean, in the moments that more countries are starting to look more inwarding to inside themselves, how can it affect Brazilian and South Korea global value chains? Again, both of you have already somehow touched upon the subjects, but if each of you could just, again, give one last highlight about this specific issue, because I think it's a very timely issue, so we can close our panel here. So, Joonkoo, I'll start with you.
Well, yes. Well, I think it's trade barriers, or more specifically, the U.S. and China trade wars actually put a lot of pressure to actually, well, their international flow of trade and their. But well, recently I work on their paper, which is about the historical experience of the trade war or the trade barriers on the global value chain, or their flow of their international their trade. And when you're looking at for example, 1980s, there is a lot of the trade tension or the trade conflict between the U.S. and Japan, and and also the U.S. and there's some of the East Asian newly industrializing countries like their Korea, and because that there's a lot of their imports from Japan, Korea, Taiwan to the U.S. And looking at the, for example, apparel industry, actually, well, by the end of 1980s, and the Korea and the Taiwan and Hong Kong as the major exporter to the U.S. and the U.S. trying to actually they're trying to curb their inflow of the apparel products from East Asia, and eventually some of like the trade tension eventually lead to their not the shrinkage of their apparel value chain in East Asia, but later actually it expanded their production networks in Asia, because that the Korean company or the Taiwanese company to divert their trade barriers, they actually make an investment to the other countries. So the Korean companies invested in their China and the later Vietnam and others, and also Taiwanese did the same thing. So I think is the message is that trade barrier is just one way to actually impact their global value chain. The farm actors, corporations, actually trying to find a way to actually divert their trade barriers a lot of different ways, and I think the same things taking place nowadays. So I think it is hard to say that the end result, whether the end result is the shrinkage of the global value chain or unexpected kind of like their restructuring or their re-expansion of the global value chain. I think the juries are still out there.
Great. Otaviano, same question.
Yes, I guess it is important, Leonardo, to differentiate the two fronts of the trade frictions. One thing is the trade wars on goods and to some extent service. The other one is the technology race. I strongly believe that while some of the trade wars of the Trump style unilateral will diminish, among other reasons, because it has not been that much good for the U.S. manufacturing industry. I believe this is a strong reason why President Trump refers to several issues about China, but not on the trade front, because the balance has been very negative on the results of his trade wars, except for here and there some benefits, but that's not the case. Whereas I do believe that the technology war will stay regardless of the outcome of the US elections. Huawei will have to live without Google's platforms. And to some extent, this is speeding up the rebalancing of China. So I strongly believe that that's going to be the case. As for Brazil, I still want to hammer the message that regardless of whatever is the scenario outside when it comes to trade wars and so on, the damage done by Brazil's trade closeness falls on Brazil's shoulders themselves.
Excellent, great message. Well, before closing this debate, I'd like to share with you a couple of messages. The first message is that this debate is part of a project developed by the International Intelligence Unit from the Getúlio Vargas Foundation. The first message is then, if you want to know more about it, myself and Joonkoo and Otaviano also will draft some reports. The reports are already finished. They are open to everybody. They are free. They are available at the website of the International Intelligence Unit of Getúlio Vargas. But if you go to the description of this same event, you find the link that go direct to the reports. Second message, in a couple of weeks, on the 26th, if I'm not mistaken, we'll have a second webinar with two other experts, one Korean and one Brazilian, to discuss a little bit more about the subjects about Brazil and South Korea global value chains. I mean, how they are inserting themselves, new trends, specific issues, specific characteristics of each country. So I'd like to thank my team from the International Intelligence Unit. I would like to thank you, the communications team from Getúlio Vargas Foundation. Thank you, Otaviano. Thank you, Joonkoo. It was an honor to have you here. And thank you, the audience, to share with us these moments of rich discussion. Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you soon, not virtually, but in person.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.